If we're going to reach this generation, we're going to be like Jesus in that we lead with grace and that we're characterized by grace and that we're not just filled with truth, we're filled with that holy, beautiful love that doesn't just push people away and put Facebook posts up about them, but draws them close.
Focus is here for you. I mean, we've got marriage and parenting content. We have so many things to help you, assessments and even marriage intensives, actual counseling at 4 locations. But also, how to live in this culture is a key theme for us here at Focus on the Family. And I think some of us do that maybe well, and some of us do that not so well. And so today we're going to talk with our guest about how to engage a culture really with one purpose, to introduce people to Christ, which is the glorious goal. JD, welcome to Focus on the Family.
Thank you so much, Jim, for having me. I was telling John earlier that it's an honor for me because I grew up being discipled in the back seat of my parents' car listening to Focus on the Family. My parents, they just always had it on, and we drove around Winston-Salem, North Carolina being...
That had to be extremely boring for a young boy.
Well, maybe it should have been, but I was fascinated.
Well, that's good. Let me open with this. I was just at a conference here at the Broadmoor speaking at this conference. Young people. It's all 30-something, 40-something young professionals, mostly Ivy League grads, not all Christians, but many Christians. And one of the themes they were talking about in one of the sessions they did was this isn't a culture war. This is spiritual warfare. I thought, wow, what an interesting way to rephrase that. Because culture war kind of sets us up one human being against another human being.
Right.
Spiritual warfare is about God and his kingdom versus Satan and his tribe.
Yeah.
Speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, so terms end up, having a life of their own. And a lot of times when you think culture war, people think yard signs and Facebook posts.
And Republican and Democrat.
Right. Angry diatribes, that sort of thing. But sometimes when people say culture war, what they mean is they mean clarity about truth in the public square. And that's something Christians are very supportive of. One of the things that I try to present in Everyday Revolutionary is that faithfulness to Jesus in our generation is not less than clarity about controversial issues. It's just a lot more. And I really try to build it off of the example of Daniel in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Because here's a guy, Jim, Daniel is so courageous and bold in his truth declarations that he gets thrown in the lion's den because of it. And yet he is so beloved by the king, King Darius, whose wicked decree put him there, that king stays outside the lion's den all night long, weeping, hoping against hope that Daniel will make it through the night. And I don't think he was doing that just because he missed Daniel's prophetic diatribes. I think he was doing that because he knew Daniel was genuinely his friend. He loved him. He couldn't imagine Babylon without Daniel. And so my question is, how do we as believers, how do we become like that in our society? I always tell the church that I pastor, I say, our goal is we want our community to say, we may not believe what those crazy people over at Summit Church believe, but thank God they're here, because if not, we'd have to raise our taxes.
What did Daniel possess in Babylon that the king should respond like that? Like, this guy, I like this guy. It's too bad this decree I accidentally threw out there is catching him in the snare, right? But what was it about Daniel? Was he just a good guy? He was an extrovert, had a great personality, everybody loved him.
Wit.
Yeah, obviously it's not that, but what do we learn from him about how he stood in that culture?
Yeah, well, one of the things it says is that Daniel had an excellent spirit in him.
Yeah.
And, Daniel will define that multiple times, which it says that he was neither corrupt nor negligent. It started in how he did his job. There was a disposition of grace and love. Like I said a moment ago, the king understood that Daniel was his friend and that he cared about him. Obviously, Jesus wouldn't come for, several hundred years later. But when we see Jesus, who is the truer and better Daniel, the Apostle John describes him as somebody that is filled with grace and truth. Grace and truth. It wasn't like he, had a mode where he toggled back and forth. Now I'm in grace mode. Now I'm in truth mode. It's that simultaneously he was always filled with both of them. And that is something I think you see early on in Daniel where he leads with grace.
Yeah. What are the 3 relationship types that you write about in the book? I think it's around tourist, immigrant, and exile.
Yeah.
First, give us the quick definition, and then what does it say about us spiritually in those 3 phases?
Yeah. So Daniel was an exile in Babylon, and Peter and Paul in the New Testament pick up on that language and say that's what we're supposed to be in our Babylons, which is, a metaphor for wherever you live right now. If you think about the three possible options that you can be if you're not from a place, you can be a tourist. A tourist is somebody who, they never put roots down. They hardly unpack their bag.
They're there for the weekend.
They're there for the weekend. If there's a problem in the community, that's not your problem. You're there to see the sights. A lot of Christians are like that when it comes to the world. They're just passing through. They're, holding hands, singing Kumbaya, waiting for the rapture. They never really think of this world as something that their problems is our problems.
So you're really saying they're non-engagement.
They're non-engagement.
They're not engaged.
And they're just so separate. They're so separated. And that actually is, Jeremiah, the prophet who lived at the time of Daniel, said, don't do that. I put you into Babylon so that you could seek the prosperity of the city. Jeremiah 29:7, and pray for its prosperity. Make its problems your problems. So that's tourist. Well, the other one is immigrant. That's when you're not from a place, but you really want to make it your home. You want to switch your citizenship there. And a lot of Christians, we have that problem because we're like, well, this world really is my home. I want to pile up all my treasure here, and I become more of a citizen of the United States than I do the kingdom of heaven, and I reflect its values even more than heaven's values. The right posture is not tourist or immigrant. It's an exile. An exile is there. You plan to live there. You plan to care about the place and get integrated into it and take on its problems as your own. But the whole time you are reminded that this is not really my home. My home ultimately is in a different kingdom. And we as believers are citizens of heaven that are living in exile right now in the kingdom of man.
In that regard, you had a story in the book about a lesbian couple that came to your church. I would think while you're up there on stage and you see somebody come in and it's obvious they're in relationship together.
Yeah.
You got to go to yourself like, okay, what's this about, Lord? I mean, if we're honest.
Right. What's about to happen?
And what's about to happen. But it was a great story. What happened in that regard? And really, if I could tease it up a little bit, like what was working behind your eyeballs?
Oh, my goodness, yeah.
To give us that insight.
Well, there's a lot of color in this story because the first time I really became aware of this, one of the two came to meet with me and basically told me that she'd been coming to our church for 6 months without me knowing because she was coming without her
partner.
Her partner.
Yeah.
And she'd gotten saved. She sat in my office with tears streaming down her face telling me about her relationship with Christ. And she knew that what she was in, she could no longer be in, and she was trying to figure out what to do.
That is so awesome.
Right.
I just want to jump out of my skin right here and go, that is awesome.
Right. So we're praying about it. And well, she told me, she said, so when I presented this to my partner looked you guys up, figured out kind of how you felt about homosexuality, because our church is very clear on that, and said, there ain't no way I'm going to that church because they won't accept us. And so she looked at some other churches, let's call them liberal churches, and she said, here, we can go here because there you can get your God stuff and they accept us. She said, I went to that church for 3 weeks and I looked at her on week 3 and I called her name, said, I'm telling you right now, God ain't in this place.
Wow.
And we can go over to this church, Summit Church, where God is and they don't accept our lifestyle, or we can come here where they accept us, but the Spirit of God is not. And she said, I'm going to where God is.
That's pretty sensitive for her.
Oh, right.
To even have that awareness.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing. They're looking for that affirmation that what we are, what we do is okay, and you accept it. And when we say, no, that's not a biblical understanding of human sexuality, they interpret that as hate. That is not hate. It's actually just truth.
Well, that leads to the second part of the story, which is, I found out that the partner, who has a little bit of a pride issue, she would admit that later, she waited till her partner, the one who had gotten saved, the partner who got saved, was out of town, and then she decided she would visit us on her own. So she slips in. I see her come in and sit on the second row because I recognize her. She sits there, and I'm telling you, Jim, in 5 years, I've probably only one time preached the entire sermon that was all about same-sex relationships, and it was that Sunday.
But she didn't know that.
She had no idea, and I had no idea she was going to be there.
God's timing.
God's timing. So she kind of bows up, and I see this happening. She pulls out a notepad. She told me this part later, and she thought, I knew it. These people are obsessed with us. This is all they ever talk about. I'm going to write down all the hateful things he says so I can show my partner that this is not the place for us. She said after 10 minutes, She said, I had tears running down my face and a blank piece of paper. And I said, I won't tell you exactly what she said because it's not fit for radio. She said, doggone it. She said, this is the most loving anti-gay sermon I've ever heard in my life. And she basically tells me in my office, she says similar things. She says, I kept coming. God has changed me. I've become a believer. I will need to know what to do now.
Yeah.
And that led to the dissolution of their marriage. It led to, their baptisms and that thing. But when it started with an encounter with Jesus, and the point was, how do you take Jesus to people there and not just preach against them, like you're a pundit in a culture war, but like you're someone filled with grace and truth, befriending them and bringing them close.
And it's such a beautiful thing. I mean, there's not perhaps a avalanche of that testimony, but I've had that experience in the gay community with people that I know there where they've moved closer to Christ. And that's the goal, to help them.
This is Focus on the Family with Jim Daly, and our guest today is Pastor J.D. Greear, and we're talking about some of the content in his terrific book, Everyday Revolutionary: How to Transcend the Culture War and Transform the World. Thank you for joining us, and if you find this content meaningful, hit that subscribe button so we can keep growing and improving together.
I don't want to lose this, so let me dig a little deeper, JD, before we move to another topic. But the difference between leading with the gospel or leading with political messaging. This is one of the great grapples that I have at Focus on the Family, because so much of what conservatives do in the Republican Party, just to be blunt, pro-life, pro-marriage, pro-family. So we find a natural home there politically because that's what they're standing up for. Yeah. And, I talk with the Democrats and I'll say, if you were more pro-life, more pro-family, more pro-marriage in the context of the Bible, marriage between a man and a woman, you'd have a lot more people in your party. But, so I'm always, I think, a little offended that we get labeled that we're only political. It's where the values are lining up. I really don't care if it was an R or a D, but I will discern where do they line up. Right. So am I seeing that correctly? And then when I get hit with the political thing, just shrug it off? Or how do you process that?
Yeah, I think so, Jim, because, there are certain issues that when you talk about them, you're going to sound partisan, even if you don't mean to. When we're talking about the sanctity of life, when we're talking about sanity on gender and marriage and religious freedom. Yes, you sound partisan, but I'm not trying to sound partisan. I'm just sounding biblical, and we've just got to be okay with that. What I think we can do, though, even with that, is we can be wise and prudential about how we leverage labels and what we even lead with. If I could tell you a quick
I like
story.
it. This is great.
Okay, so there was I got a letter one day at our church from a young lady that I'd never met before. I didn't know I'd never met her before, but it was a picture of her at our church being baptized. And she said, I want to tell you a story about how I came to the church. She said, I was invited by some friends of mine and I started to come. She said, I very quickly discerned that you made me quite angry, because she was from the West Coast and she was...
That's all you got to say.
Right.
I grew up in California.
Okay, so yes, well, she was at a California university.
Okay.
And she said, just when I talked about the sanctity of life and some of these, hot button issues, she said, and one day she said, you said something about, in support of a pro-life position on, it was called Twitter then. Yeah. And she said, I sniped back at you. Now, Jim, I never respond on Twitter.
Right. I don't even read it.
Right. Quit. I don't know what came over me, but I did. For whatever reason, I responded, and I said something back to her, and she said something back to me, and we went back 4 or 5 times, and I forgot about it. I remember her handle for Twitter was something like Left Linda or something like that. Just something that clearly
At least
identified.
she's honest.
At least she was honest. She said, then she told me, she said, I was Left Linda who did that with you on Twitter. She said, I kept coming to the church. Again, she heard the gospel. She got saved. And she said, now I'm in the process of rethinking everything. Wow. Everything. But what she said next is the reason I'm telling this story is she said, I want to thank you, though, that even though you were clear about controversial truths, I want to thank you that you didn't make this the Republican church. Because if you had made it the Republican church, she said, I never could have stepped foot inside it. Political realignment often happens when somebody comes to Christ. But political realignment is downstream. It's the result of discipleship.
Right.
It should not be the gateway to it.
And it's very difficult to, use politics to convert somebody. I mean, because your angst goes up.
Yeah.
You're there to defend your position,
Right.
no matter who you are, the Democrat or the Republican. And that I don't really see that model expressed in Jesus's parables.
So what that means practically for me is that means that there are certain discussions I will step out of so that I can keep my focus on the primary discussion.
Yeah, so good.
Yeah, and that primary discussion is the gospel and the lordship of Christ.
Yeah.
As we do that, JD, you made reference in the book to living a quiet life. There's a passage in one of the epistles about doing that, being quiet in our
It
lives.
sounds so hard to do.
I know, right?
I'm an extrovert.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
quiet
For guys
life.
like us.
You're kidding me.
For you, and then for those who are, on social media or
Yeah.
buying into all the back and forths, how do we live a quiet life representing
Please
Christ well?
tell me.
Yeah, that's right. Well, keep in mind that the guy who used that phrase, 1 Thessalonians 4:11, live quietly, is the Apostle Paul, who I would also not describe as a guy who lived a sheepish
Right.
life, right? I mean, this is the guy that stood in the Ephesian amphitheater and told the entire Ephesian crowd, you're worshiping gods that are not gods at all. How was he telling us to live quietly? And he doesn't mean that you are muting your testimony. What he is saying is that the bedrock for your testimony is a life like Daniel's that was so involved in blessing the community around you that they would, and now let me use the Apostle Peter's words, ask a reason for the hope that is within you. A quiet life is a setup for a loud testimony. It's a way of living in a way that serves your neighbor, blesses them, makes their lives better in a way that they say, hey, I need to know what's motivating you. I need to know the hope that you have, and that sets up an opportunity for a loud testimony.
JD, I can remember before coming to Focus in 1989. I know that's been a while.
Back in the 1900s.
Yeah, back in the 1900s. But I worked for International Paper, and I remember going to lunch, and this will lead into the question. That's why I'm telling this story. But, I'm 27, 28, and I'd be at lunch with people, business people. And when the lunch would come, I'd say, hey, you guys mind if I pray over lunch? And they'd put their cigarette out, set their martini down. It was so funny. And then I'd just say a little prayer. But it does lead into this idea that you talk about faithful work outside of the church. And so often, I remember somebody I consulted, a business guy, when I was looking at, should I go into work in the nonprofit world with Focus? He was saying, man, I want to discourage that because we need Christians in the public sector, in the private sector, to be able to be a witness. If all the Christians just go work in churches and Christian ministry, we're not going to have. So I thought about that. It really did slow the decision down. But speak to the importance of waking up every day. If you're not working at a church and you're not working at a Christian ministry, how do you go about getting amped up to go, okay, Lord, I'm heading in to be the plumber, the electrician, the engineer, the doctor, take your vocation. But do we connect that directly to our faith?
Yeah, Billy Graham very famously said before he died that the next great awakening, he believed, would not happen in the stadiums, it would happen in the workplace. And we have ample biblical support for that because, if you just read the book of Acts, I know the apostles loved the local church. The local church was the center of their ministry program. And yet, most of the preaching that they do is outside of the local church context, at least in Acts.
It's where the action is.
It's where the action is. That's right. There are 40 miracles in the book of Acts. 39 of them happen outside of the church.
Yeah.
I always tell our people, sort of tongue in cheek, but I'm like, that means as a pastor who works inside the church, I've got access to about 1/40th of the power of God. I know that's not great hermeneutics, but you get the point.
Totally.
Is that most of what Jesus wants to do in our communities is not going to happen from the pastor in the pulpit. It's from people in the workplace. And the workplace gives people a chance to put the values of the kingdom of God in contrast with the values of Babylon.
You write in the book about the local church investing in community. That's true of all of us. As a household, as well as a community of believers through a church. What does that look like for the church to invest in community?
Yeah, I was preaching through the book of Acts, and I came to Acts 8, where it says that Philip, as a result of the ministry that he had in Samaria, that there was much joy in the city because of the word that he preached and the works that he did. And so, Jim, I asked our congregation, do y'all feel like there's much joy in our city as a result of our presence here. The next chapter, Acts 9, talks about a disciple by the name of Tabitha who makes cloaks and coats for people in her community. And when she died, people gathered at her bedside and they wept because of all the good things she'd done for them. And I said to our congregation, do y'all feel like our community would weep if we were gone?
Great question.
And we felt like the answer to both those questions was no. And so I scheduled a meeting with the mayor. And this mayor was not, I mean, he's not on our team, Jim. I kind of joke about him. He's kind of to the left of Mao Zedong is kind of how I thought of this guy. I said, Mr. Mayor, will you tell me the most needy parts of our city? And without batting an eye, he said the homeless, the orphan, the prisoner, the unwed mother, and the high school dropout. I went back to our congregation and just said, I felt like the mayor of our city has given us a blueprint for how we should bring the joy of Jesus into these areas. Not all the ministries that we've started in those areas came from my head or inside the offices of the church. But now for 20 years, we've seen ministry after ministry after ministry develop. We have numbers, as an example, of foster kids that are now taken care of by families at the Summit Church. I told the mayor just this past Sunday, I had him back at church and I said, hey, our goal is we're not going to stop this until there are more families in the Summit Church that are ready to receive foster kids than there are foster kids in the program.
Oh, you got my heart.
Yeah, well, that's just, I mean, and it may be something different for your church, but it's a commitment to loving the city and bringing joy to it in the name of Jesus, yes, but by meeting physical needs.
You know, one thing I've said, when you look at the number of churches, and, you know, we use this analogy often about a lot of things, but there's about 360,000 churches in the U.S., and there's about 350,000 foster kids in the foster program. Wow. That's one kid per church.
One kid per church, wow.
And it is tough. It's not easy. It's not for the faint of heart to take a child in. But I would love to see that New York Times headline that says, Christian church wipes out waiting foster care
Amen. That's right.
list. That would so inspire everybody outside of the church too, because now you're walking the talk. And God bless those Christian families that are doing it. And Gene and I were so rewarded internally with doing it ourselves. It wasn't easy, but there's a lot of demand for really good parenting. Let me ask you this. In the book, you get down to 3 reference points that you give Christians to be courageous witnesses for Christ. This so goes along with our Truth Rising documentary. If you haven't seen it yet, please watch it. Okay. I'll send you the link.
Yeah.
But it talks about courageous Christians that, first of all, it sets up the Western civilization. It's heady. And then we get into examples like a detransitioner, Chloe Cole, and Jack Phillips, the baker, and many others who had that Daniel moment and stood and said, you know what, this is not right. And how God got them through those things. It's beautiful. But in that way, those reference points, what are they?
The first thing is that we have to participate in what some Christian theologians have called the commons. That's a concept that goes all the way back to St. Augustine. And it means that we do our work in secular places, and a lot of times the people who benefit from our work they don't share our convictions.
Right.
The homeowner or the home builder, that builds a neighborhood, and there's an unmarried couple that buys one of his houses, or there's a gay couple that buys one of his houses, he's not become complicit in their sin because he provided the home. That's just participating in the commons. That's one, and that's as old as Christian history itself. But then there's a second principle you have to hold in tension with that one, which is we can never fellowship with the works of darkness, which means that I can't participate with you in your sin. A good example is, I would have a real problem. I could not be a part of a ceremony of celebration for a gay wedding, even if the two people were my friends, that I was trying to reach for Jesus. I couldn't do that because I would be participating in and affirming something that was wrong. But that's the second principle is while we are participating in the commons, we cannot fellowship with darkness. The third one, though, is as we engage in those first two, even when we're clear that I can't be a part of this and I can't affirm this, maybe it has to do with how you're being asked to use pronouns or refer to gender. I mean, there's a million examples we could come up with. Even there, I can still lead with grace. I want to be filled with truth. I never want it to be said of our generation that we did not teach the whole counsel of God with clarity. But if we're going to reach this generation, we're going to be like Jesus in that we lead with grace, and that we're characterized by grace, and that we're not just filled with truth. We're filled with that holy, beautiful love that doesn't just push people away and put Facebook posts up about them, but draws them close.
Yeah, I agree. I think the spirit right now, with everything going on in the culture, even, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, there's an opening to show that boldness.
Yeah.
And to do it well, not do it nasty. Do not, don't attack people verbally, but be bold and show your convictions.
Yeah.
I think the moment is now. I think God has really created that platform.
Yeah, amen to that.
And man, this is so good, JD. I could just keep going, but we're out of time. And I want to say thank you for writing, first of all, this great book. And I think we've given the audience quite a appetite, hopefully, for this, whet the appetite. But, let's make it simple. If you can participate in ministry, send us a donation of any amount, and we'll send you JD's book, Everyday Revolutionary, as our way of saying thank you for, being part of the ministry, help saving a marriage, or helping a parent in crisis, or helping Christians in the public square. It's a fun way to do it.
Yeah, donate today when you call 800-A-FAMILY, or click the link in the program description below, and that'll take you to the site where you can donate. Learn more about JD's book, Everyday Revolutionary, and also we'll have a link there for Truth Rising, the documentary Jim mentioned a few minutes ago. On behalf of the entire team, thanks for watching Focus on the Family with Jim Daly. I'm John Fuller, inviting you back as we once again help you and your family thrive in Christ.